Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another historical edition of the Politics and Patriotism Show. In this episode, it'll be my pleasure to announce the return of another one of my favorite guests. He is the noted combat historian Patrick K. O'Donnell. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because it should. He's been on this program 2 times before. Now, you first heard from him in episode 187 of this program when we discussed his Korean War book, Give Me Tomorrow, which was published in 2011 by Da Capo Press. Now, that was, to jog your memory, the story of George Company from 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Division during the Korean War. And if the Chosin Reservoir rings a bell, that's because it should. Now, anybody who's interested, go back, find the episode, have a listen, and learn something.
That old Marine Corps spirit.
Give me 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 that old Marine Corps spirit.
And it's good enough for me.
And it's good enough for me.
It was good at Busan Perimeter.
It was good at Busan Perimeter.
It was good at the Frozen Chosen.
It was good at the Frozen Chosen.
It was good at Korea.
It was good at Korea.
And it's good enough for me.
And it's good enough for me.
Now, just in case you didn't get enough of 3rd Battalion 1st Marines, we had Pat back a little bit later on in episode 231 to discuss his book We Were One, which was published a bit earlier in 2007, again, courtesy of Da Capo Press. Now, We Were One was his account of the 2004 battle for Fallujah, and it was also chock full of oral histories from the Marines of 1st Division who were actually there. Now, Pat O'Donnell does 2 things which are of particular interest to me when he writes military history, and I want to bring both of these to your attention. The first of which is that he brings actual experience to his work. He has actually been to a battlefield. He's not like one of these classroom academics who's never actually been there or seen it, and he's just working from what he sees in books. He's been there, and his experience shows through in his word choices. Now, the second thing that he does is he relies very heavily on oral histories. And for those of you who are oral history buffs should go and check out his website, thedropzone.org. This is specifically an oral history bank of World War II experience that he started a long time ago, back when the internet was still a baby. And you may find all kinds of useful nuggets of information there. And the reason that I bring up the World War II aspect of this is that it's relevant to the interview that we're about to bring you today, which relates to his latest book. It's called Dog Company. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to tell you all about it.
1, 2, 3, 4. Listen up, I'm gonna sing you some more. I turn travel to the Bellow Woods. We're making history so it's understood. Evil demon to we're going to now. Picking butt just to everywhere. Throw the chosen to the whole team, man. I think it's time that we do it again.
Dog Company is Pat O'Donnell's latest book, published in November of 2012 by Da Capo Press. It's the story of a very special mission which took place on June 6th of 1944, and that's Operation Overlord for you D-Day aficionados out there. And this is specifically the action of 2nd Ranger Battalion and their assault on the cliffs of Pointe Du Hoc. D Company scales the cliffs and they attack the guns that overlook the heights. These are the guns that could have endangered the beachheads and destroyed many landing craft. They could have even brought fire on some of the ships that were supporting the attack itself. That's how serious this whole thing was. And these special operations troops, specifically United States Army Rangers, they went up the cliffs directly into hostile enemy fire, and they got the job done. But there's more to the story than that. Most of us, all we ever see or hear in the history books or in the videos that we watch on the military channel or anything else, all we see is the stuff about Pointe Du Hoc. Yay, it's great, it's wonderful. But, there was more to the war than that. After 2nd Ranger Battalion moves inland, there's a whole lot more fighting going on. There are Nazi tank formations. There are elite parachute regiments. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And the story of what these men do is so much bigger than attacking the guns at Pointe Du Hoc that you've just got to read this thing in order to believe it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, it sounds good. There's a lot of history here. We're going to hear about stuff we didn't know about. And that's true. But I would like you to think about this before we get the ball rolling. Everything you are going to hear about here is what they call a precursor event. All of this U.S. Army Ranger stuff, in many respects, was being done for the first time. And all the things you hear about by way of special operations activity in Iraq, in Afghanistan today, it all had its roots back in the D-Day operations of 1944. So when you hear Pat talking about the training that these guys go through in preparation for the attack on Pointe Du Hoc, all of that is being done in many cases for the first time. They're making that stuff up as they went along. And now today, it's chapter and verse for the United States Army Ranger Training Manual. So, hey, if you're looking for history, this is the real deal. So click or point your browser towards www.dogcompanythebook.com and let's get into the action.
Off to battle we will go. Off to battle we will go. To live or die, hell I don't know. To live or die, hell I don't know. Hey, low, infantry. Hey, low, infantry. Queen of battle, follow me. Queen of battle, follow me.
My name is Patrick K. O'Donnell, and it's been a very special month. Last week I received something called the Waller Award for scholarship in intelligence and special operations history. I received the award in front of 800 sort of who's who in the intelligence and special operations community at the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. It was really quite a special night. And then dovetailing that award, I gave the Distinguished Service Medal to one of the OSS's greatest agents, Frederick Mayer, who was the main character of my book, They Dared Return. They also aired a 5-minute clip of a film that they based on They Dared Return and Fred's story, which was the Green Up mission, which was this incredible behind-the-lines mission that was executed by Jewish refugees that dressed as German officers. It's the true story behind Inglourious Bastards.
Okay, now you are, of course, a combat historian, but for those who don't know, please tell us what that is, because it's relevant to the topic of discussion that we have here today.
Well, the term combat historian is one that I kind of coined when I went to Iraq. I was one of the first, if not the first, volunteer historians that went to Iraq in battle with our troops. I found out early on in sort of the training exercises that I went through that if you don't actually participate, you're not going to get the story. You're not going to be able to get the real story of what happens if you're just sitting behind the wire. And I actively, I was in uniform and I was engaged in combat in the Battle of Fallujah and some other actions in Iraq in 2004. in 2005. And then subsequently, the focus of my books has been Americans in combat, and what it's like to be at the tip of the spear, either in special ops or in some cases behind the line. I think that the books that I've written have sort of reflected that perspective in one way or another, and I try to capture that look, if you will, or feel in the books that I've written. And then Dog Company is definitely, we try to take on that characteristic of putting you in the boots of the men themselves, these rangers.
I think you've definitely hit the ball out of the park with this one, and if you don't mind my saying, I think that I have noticed a transition in your work going from We Were One through Give Me Tomorrow to this. I have detected just in the not just in talking to you personally, but in the word choices you've made in your writing, I have detected a real change in the way that you think. And I think that you've really managed to pursue this goal successfully of transmitting the heat and the emotion and the whole package of everything that goes on outside the wire.
Well, thank you very much. That's a high compliment considering you've read many military history books. But this is definitely, definitely been an evolving art form in many ways. And this book, I've definitely learned from the prior books that I've written, and I think that this one I've sort of been at the top of my game in many ways, in the way that I've constructed it, and in the way that I researched it, learned how to research more efficiently, and then just kind of know what I'm looking for. I just have this intuitive sense of how to put the story together.
There's another portion of this too. And I think, and it's just a value judgment on my part here, just because I'm just an armchair observer. When I talked to you, the last time I talked to you, you mentioned offhand, off air, that you were still processing some of what you had gone through in Fallujah, and I had remarked that for me, in some ways, that writing is therapy, and you'd commiserated along similar lines. So I think that Dog Company I think it was good therapy for you, and I think it helped you achieve your goal.
Sure on that. I can definitely say that with assurance, though, that I could associate with what these guys had gone through, because I had experienced some similar things where I had seen the men of 1st Platoon in Fallujah experience similar things that they experienced in battle, or that they had experienced when they had come home, and I was able to sort of translate or transmit that into Dog Company by understanding that, and then putting it into words, or putting the men's words of Dog Company into the story, which I think is very important. The book sort of transcends a typical war story. It really is about men in battle and what they've gone through. And I think the deeper story was, this is an iconic event, the climbing of the cliffs, but what you don't really hear is the backstory, or how many of these men had to cope with the war. And that sort of comes out in the book in different ways.
All right, then, set the stage for us. I think we've had enough of a teaser here. Tell us, first let's start with the overview here. What is Dog Company? What do we need to know about this initially, just to get our audience started?
Dog Company is a band of brothers on the Rangers that climbed the cliffs of Pointe Du Hoc and destroyed the guns. It's also their story, but it's their story through the eyes of its greatest characters, from training through the entire war in what they considered their longest day, which was a place called Hill 400 in the Hyrcan Forest that they had to assault with a bayonet charge, and then they held the hill miraculously for 2 days against enemy assaults and 18 battalions of German artillery. It's an epic story, an epic battle right there in itself, and this book captures their war, basically, from 1943 through 1945. They come home.
Okay, now let's do what you have done so well in the past. Let's start with the men. And now this whole thing centers around D Company, which is part of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. What is it about D Company that makes them so utterly exceptional beyond all the other companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, other than the fact that they seem to have the most exceptional luck when it comes to being in the right place at the right time?
Well, I think it's definitely luck and training and leadership, and a lot of things kind of rolled into one. But Dog Company accomplished effectively most of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's missions on D-Day single-handedly. They were able to scale the cliffs, and then the guns at Pointe Du Hoc were considered the most important objective for the American landing beaches, because there were these large guns on top of the cliff that could reach Omaha and Utah Beach, as well as the ships that were in the channel, and they had to be destroyed at all costs. The outcome of the invasion potentially could hinge on that, on those guns. The Allies threw quite a bit at it. They put about 700 tons of aerial bombardment on Pointe Du Hoc, cratering the thing like the surface of a moon. They also shelled it with 14-inch guns from the Texas and other battleships, in shore bombardment, but nothing seemed to work except for one man from Dog Company, and that's one of the most exceptional parts of the book, is how one man and his partner basically, in some cases, they fought through. Len Lamel was wounded in the side. They had to fight through a labyrinth of trenches on top of Pointe Du Hoc. The thing was a fortress, which was ringed by literally thousands of anti-personnel mines and barbed wire, not to mention passing German patrols, and they had to fight through all this. And they had, Len Lamel also had the foresight to see that there were these large tire marks in this earthen road, and he followed where he thought the guns were, and he was right. And he placed thermite grenades on the gears of the guns and disabled them. And that's just one part of this book that makes Dog Company exceptional. But they were sort of the assault force in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and they were utilized in that manner throughout the rest of the war, including in a place called Hill 400, where they make this desperate bayonet charge.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
We got your 6, and there's nothing you can do about it.
I want to save Hill 400 for later, because that was one of many parts of 2nd Ranger history that I myself was utterly ignorant of, and there's a twist involved in that, which is just absolutely fantastic stuff. I mean, it's better than Hollywood, and it's enough to really provoke my historical interest. It's one of those things you can talk about what ifs forever. But going back to before the assault, now in today's world, special operations forces are just the bomb. They get lots of hype, and there's all kinds of stuff out there about them. You turn on the military channel, and there's everything in the world about how these guys get trained. And we have to remember that back in the 1940s, all that stuff, all that nifty gear wasn't, and a lot of these doctrines and tactics weren't. And so the Ranger battalions that go ashore on D-Day are, in many cases, built from whole cloth. So you spend a few early chapters in this book talking about the training that these guys go through, and all that stuff sounds perfectly normal today, but at that point in time, it was new stuff. So if you would please, go through it and explain why it was new in the day.
Special operations were totally it was a new concept that for World War II for the most part, even though throughout American history We've had special operations going all the way back to the French and Indian War with Robert's Rangers. And then you have the American Revolution, but it's in World War II where we sort of reinvent Spec Ops, and then we have to sort of reinvent the complete wheel in many ways, and nobody really knows what they're doing. And it's very interesting. I could go on and on this, but I mean, the OSS is probably the real precursor to American Special Operations. It's a large trunk of a tree, and in that tree trunk you have the OSS, you have the Rangers, you have to some degree the Airborne Raiders, Merrill's Marauders, Alamo Scouts. You can go on, but in that trunk there's this branch that shoots out, which is the Rangers, and they fight largely as elite infantry. And they do have some special operations missions, and the mission at Pointe Du Hoc is one of those great special operations missions. They have to somehow scale a 90-foot cliff under direct enemy fire. It's like going at Pickett's charge, but also scaling a cliff. And they had to figure out how to do it. And then the training, though, is they sort of make it up as they go along. The 1st Ranger Battalion has some of that initial training, and most of it is really geared at trying to break men physically. They've got these long speed marches. They have a lot of like hand-to-hand kind of combat training that they have to go through, a lot of physical conditioning. This is what is, men are very, like, they're very tough. They're all volunteers, and if they can't cut it, they wash out. And there's a lot of people that don't make it in the Rangers. But what makes them very unique about their mission for the 2nd Ranger Battalion in particular, as well as the 5th, is they spent about 6 months prior to D-Day climbing cliffs every single day. And they were climbing these cliffs that were between 100 and 300 feet high, and they were doing it without safety ropes or harnesses. They were just climbing up ropes in their full gear. And then what I found is interesting is their officers, and this is in some of the diaries that I found, their officers actually would fire upon them, fire over their heads as they were climbing, just to give it a realistic feel for combat.
Now, speaking of realistic feel, you also made a point of documenting the fact that these guys trained against an OPFOR.
They did. They did it at a place called at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And the Ritchie boys are very interesting, and they sort of trace their way a little bit back to the story that I told at the very beginning of this conversation about a book that I wrote called They Dared Return, where there were a number of Jewish refugees that spoke German and everything else, and they went back. Camp Ritchie had a number of men that were refugees. Some of them were Jewish, and they trained our guys on they were the OPFOR, if you will, the opposing force. They would train our men in what German tactics looked like, and they would go through a number of exercises and things. And so they had to deal with that at Camp Ritchie, which gave them training. But the thing that they also learned to do at Camp Ritchie was fire German weapons, which came in very handy as time went on. Because what happened is at Pointe Du Hoc and in other battles, these men ran out of ammunition or their weapons were damaged, and they ended up using German weapons. In particular, they used one of the greatest machine guns of the war, the MG-42, which could fire up to 1,500 rounds per minute, which was almost twice the rate of fire of a Browning 30 caliber machine gun.
Now, the climbing of the cliffs at Pointe Du Hoc is, as a military feat, it's impressive in and of itself. And when they get to the top and they discover the fake guns up there, it's a stunner, to be sure. And I've seen some things in the past. I can't quote chapter and verse here, but I've seen some written military history in the past that's been mildly derisive of that. So for the sake of posterity, because this will live forever once it's uploaded onto iTunes, would you please take a moment and talk about the limitations of aerial reconnaissance in 1944? Because while that may sound like a cheesy bit of hokey deception to us today, that was that was real art back then, and it was taking advantage of the limitations of the cameras.
Well, it was not only taking advantage of the limitation of the cameras, but it was also taking advantage of the fact that aerial bombardment was very imprecise. They plastered the top of Pointe Du Hoc with thousands of bombs and failed to hit their target because the Germans were smart. They had taken the guns, which were they were initially going to be in these reinforced concrete kind of kettle positions that were supposedly kind of impervious to a lot of bombardment. But the Germans knew that the Americans knew that the guns were going to be in there, so they actually towed the guns about 800 yards inland and placed them in an apple orchard under camouflage netting. And then what they did is they placed telephone poles in the gun positions. And many films have gotten this wrong. The worst case is Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day. They basically have the Rangers scaling the cliffs, getting to the top, and then saying, "Oh my God, the guns aren't there." And then they stop the film as far as Pointe Du Hoc goes, and everybody thinks, "Oh, the mission was a disaster. It was a failure. Why did all these guys risk their lives when the guns weren't even there?" When in reality, they were. They were just towed a little bit further inland, and they were ready to go. The ammunition was next to the guns, and they were positioned to fire upon Utah Beach. They could have easily swung the other way and fired on Omaha had it not been for Len Lamell and Jack Kuhn.
Yes, very true. Now, I would just like to point out for the benefit of our listeners that in another episode of this program, we had an opportunity to interview retired Ranger John C. Ron, who took part in the D-Day landings as part of 5th Rangers, and he had some things to say about his part in the relief of the Pointe Du Hoc mission. So if you want to go to politicsandpatriotism.com and look that up, you can hear that. That's a full hour episode. And going back to the Pointe Du Hoc mission, the one thing I didn't know about that myself is that I knew that the guns had been moved, but I really was not aware that the German counterattacks were as severe as they were. I knew that they had counterattacked, but according to what you show here, they were quite severe, and it was a near-run thing, and I was never really clear on that. So can you describe that in a little more detail here? Because if I'm not clear on that, I think a lot of our listeners will be unclear on that, because Dog Company almost didn't hold out there.
That's very true. What happened is, after the guns were destroyed, the secondary objective was to cut the communication route between Utah and Omaha Beach. And Pointe Du Hoc was this peninsula or finger that just basically jutted out between the two of them, and the road ran right astride the top of Pointe Du Hoc. So the Rangers' secondary mission after destroying the guns was to cut the road, and they set up a roadblock near the road, near the guns actually, in sort of an L-shaped position. And this is sort of an untold story that I wasn't even completely aware of the full extent of just how close it was. In fact, nearly an entire platoon of Easy Company they were overrun and captured. And that's sort of an untold story. What I found is some of the original oral histories that were done about 2 months after D-Day that were buried in the wrong place at the National Archives. And some of those accounts really graphically captured what happened the night of D-Day when the Germans attacked. And then I pieced that together with oral histories that I had done with the Ranger veterans that were still alive, as well as other accounts, and came up with this picture of it was a very, very close thing. And I think one quote kind of captures the spirit of that, which was there was a commando observer, Colonel Trevor, who helped train the Rangers for Pointe Du Hoc. He was part of the number one commando for the British Army. And he said never in my life had I felt that I would either be killed or captured that night. And I think that was very much the real truth to how close it was. They nearly overran they overran most of the line. Only D Company actually held. And they were sort of in a more secluded area. They were behind this hedgerow, so it was a little bit harder for the Germans to detect them. But the other Rangers actually had to fall back to the gun positions in some of the bunkers within Pointe Du Hoc, and they fired from there with captured weapons for the next 2 days, and they held out, barely.
You've said something here that I find interesting. Now, going back to our previous conversation relating to Give Me Tomorrow, which is your book about the Korean War, you said that in doing your research, you found misplaced oral histories relating to that. And so I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody here, but I'm just curious to know, from your experience as a researcher, is this a chronic problem, or is it just lazy librarians, or what?
No, I don't think so. I just, it's all of the above sometimes. The OSS archives are so large, for instance, that there's almost 3 or 4 cubic miles of records, and the way that that's cataloged, you're almost like drilling for oil sometimes. That's a situation where you just really don't know what you're going to get, and there is a lot of archival miscues there for sure. I mean, if you compare that system with the OSS records to the SOE records, for instance, in Kew Gardens, which are all, in many cases, some are digitized, but they have a beautiful computer system index that identifies where everything is at. There's a big difference between those two record groups. It's just hard to say, though. In this case, I don't want to cast an aspersion on the Ranger record groups, but it just happened to be the way that they were, and I uncovered this stuff, fortunately, and it's reflected in the book.
Well, I do think you have a knack for finding solid gold. That's very true. Now let's pick up the story here. The survival of these guys of Pointe Du Hoc is quite remarkable. It speaks to their courage, to be sure, and I certainly didn't know that this is not the only gun battery that they have experience with. So as they move on, as the campaign goes further inland, tell us about their experience at Fortress Brest and the Graf's Bay gun batteries, because that also was news to me.
The Graf's Bay gun battery is right out of the guns of Navarone. But instead of a mountaintop thing, it's a buried gun position that's 4 stories deep underground, with an elevator and a working hospital, an officer's mess hall, the whole 9 yards. And it's this buried gun position that's in a farmer's field that nobody can detect. They can't find it. They're not sure where it's at, but it has battleship-sized guns that are radar-controlled, and the guns are very effective. They, for instance, the British tried to bring in the battleship Warspite, and the Graf Spee battery basically slightly damaged the warship and put a ring of artillery shells near around it, forcing her to leave the area. So the guns were very effective in that on naval targets, but also they were used against land targets. And this fortress was the next objective for the 2nd Ranger Battalion. It was another suicide mission in many ways. The fortress was manned by 800 Germans, and the 2nd Ranger Battalion was only about 600 men roughly, and they had to figure out a way to take this thing. And it was a very tough nut to crack. They fought for several weeks in and around the Graf Spee battery, and I never forget some of the accounts these guys told me, that the shells sounded like freight trains coming in, and then an entire shell, one shell could disintegrate a small hill. near them. And that happened in a couple occasions where a shell came in and just buried men alive in their foxholes.
You mentioned that, and honestly, I thought back to some of the accounts I read of World War I, where large numbers of men were buried alive in their trenches.
That's exactly kind of what it was like. A nearby hill, near the trying to basically flank this gun position. And then the most remarkable part of the story, maybe I'll let you set it up, is how a couple individuals basically changed the course of the entire battle.
I have never seen a single hand grenade put to such good use.
It's definitely what I would call effective persuasion.
Okay, so tell the story. You deserve it.
The story is actually a man that I admire greatly. His name was Robert Edlin, and he's one of the real heroes of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and like Len the Mel, deserves the Medal of Honor, in my opinion. No Ranger in World War II received the Medal of Honor, but these two men probably definitely did. And the Graf Spee battery had been, in action for over 2 or 3 weeks against the 2nd Ranger Battalion as they fought near it and trying to basically find it and flank it. And what happened is as the lines got closer and closer, Robert Edlin and 3 of his men, who they called the Fabulous Four, they set out on a patrol, a reconnaissance patrol, to sort of find the guns. And they crept up to a nearby pillbox, and the pillbox had been surrounded by a minefield. So frontal assault on the Graf Spee battery was suicide because there were machine gun nests everywhere. There was barbed wire, 20-millimeter guns, anti-aircraft guns, you name it. The place was a total fortress. But Edlin spied sort of a path that it seemed like kind of worn through the minefield. So he decided to take it, and he got upon a smaller bunker that was part of this Graf Spee battery. And he forced his way into this small bunker and captured the men inside, and then demanded that they take him to the commanding officer of the battery, which they did. They went through another series of large iron doors, which were like kind of going into like this big football stadium arena. As he goes down this like cavernous tunnel, they go through the doors. There's a bunch of Germans like screaming. There's even some nurses. They go through a hospital ward. He's kind of got like a gun to the guy's back, but not really. It's not really clear if he's being taken prisoner or if he is their prisoner. He gets through. They go through an elevator, and he gets to the commanding officer's office. And instead of knocking on the door, Edlin bursts through it. And the German officer is rather calm, and he says, what do you want? And Edlin basically demands their surrender. And the officer is sort of incredulous, like, I know that you're only 4 men and I have 800. As he picks up, the phone and confirms that detail, and Edlin doesn't care, and he takes out a hand grenade. And Edlin at first told me that he put it in his stomach, but the reality is, after I interviewed him again, he told me exactly where he placed that grenade, right between the legs of that German, right in his crotch, and he demanded his surrender. And the German officer did that exactly. He was compelled to surrender, and he authorized. He commanded the entire garrison to surrender over the loudspeaker.
That really, when you get right down to it, that's better than Hollywood.
And it's a true story.
That is that's and hey, that's
and
part of
what
what makes
remarkable is that they didn't even want to give Bob Edlin the Silver Star for that.
With these big, huge events like Pointe Du Hoc and Graf Spee, it's easy to see how these guys have, by this point, with everything they've experienced, they have developed quite the edge. And so as they move on to the big crescendo of the piece, which is Hill 400, there's a lot going on there. But before we get to that, I would like you to take a few minutes and talk about just your general thoughts here about some of the individual men through that you've mentioned in the book. You've mentioned Lem Lamel. He gets, I think, most of the references as far as Dog Company goes, the members of D Company. So let's start with him. I mean, what was the process like to meet him, and what did you learn about this guy that you weren't able to cram in the book?
Well, Len was one of the most remarkable individuals that I've ever met. He's absolutely incredible. He was incredible, I should say. We met many, many years ago. He was a strong supporter of my early project called the Drop Zone. This is before I even wrote any books. It's still out there. It's dropzone.org. And the Drop Zone is an oral history project for World War II veterans. In many ways, the books are an extension of this larger project that I've had, which is to gather and preserve the stories of American veterans. And Len was one of my early supporters, and he was just an incredible hero of World War II. Make a long story short, I found myself up in the Jersey Shore about 3 years ago, and the next morning I was wondering really why I was there, and I realized that A, I didn't have another book idea, and then B, I'm like wondering who's around here. Who, how can I, other than the Battle of Monmouth, what's going on around here? And I realized that Len Lamel lived nearby, and I called him up that morning and I said, "Do you mind if I stop by? I'd love to just interview you again and say hello." And I went over to his house, and it was wonderful. It's always good to see an old friend. And we watched a Yankees game and had a can of Budweiser, and he took me back to his war and basically agreed that we needed to write a book on Dog Company, and that's how it was born. And he basically put his whole support behind it, and he enlisted he got the other men on board that were alive, and we got Dog Company done.
You put your finger on something that I think is very important there. You said his war, and I keep coming back to this whole thing about word choices, and as I look at the quotations, one of the things that strikes me about the quotations in this book, even the people we don't hear from very much in this thing, they owned this thing, man. They owned what they did, both the good and the bad, and that really stands out.
Each individual veteran in the 2nd Ranger Battalion had their own war, and then how they viewed it. And it's an interesting perspective. Some of the men definitely they looked at it as they were victorious. They overcame great adversity. And then of course you have men like Robert Fruehling, who was a radio operator that when Reagan gave his speech, it was too much for him, and he ended his life. So you have the full gamut of emotions that are reflected in the book.
I'm Luke Herbert, and this program is supported by SafeNetRadio.com.
It was very emotional stuff, and there's only so much that comes through in the written word, and I can think that for some people it was hard, and for some people it was easier.
That's true. It's like any war. I mean, everybody has their own breaking point. Everybody deals with war in their own way.
Well, that I think you've done a particularly good job with here, because not only have you managed to keep the pace, but you've also managed to keep the humanity in this thing. And there are times when military history can be terribly dry, and this is not dry stuff.
There's something exciting going on in pretty much every page of this book. There's non-stop action practically.
Well, it definitely benefits from the fact that you have been to a war zone, and even when we get to the later chapters where you get to the Hurtgen Forest, and once upon a time, back in college when I was taking military science classes, I had a chance to sit in on presentations given by veterans who'd been through the Hurtgen Forest, and universally they described it as a nightmare. So I can, and that certainly comes through. So fighting as D Company fights their way through the Hurtgen Forest as they get to Bergstein, and then as they get to the business of Hill 400, as you've got it depicted here, Hill 400, it reminds me an awful lot of Hamburger Hill, and it's only because I've seen that movie recently. And I know that the comparison is not entirely fair, but I cite that only just because of the level of brutality, if that makes any sense to you.
It does. I would say that the biggest difference in this, though, is that the amount of artillery that the Germans deployed was far greater than anything that they threw on Hamburger Hill. There was 18 battalions of artillery that were fired upon that hill, as well as friendly fire, too. And the Germans also had tanks or self-propelled guns, unlike the Chinese on Hamburger Hill. So this was a really tough battle, and somehow these guys pulled it out.
Okay, now set the stage here for this. What's the importance of Hamburger? I'm going to purge that from my memory. Okay, what is the importance of Hill 400? Because this is coming up on the end of the book, and it is presaging the Battle of the Bulge, to be sure. And I don't want to say too much more here because I want you to be able to pull the cover off that one, because I think it's a marvelous ending for the whole story. But just tell us what we need to know here.
Well, I'm going to reveal a little bit of a twist here. The thing that nobody knew from the Rangers was that the hill overlooked one of the greatest secrets of World War II before December 16th, 1944, and this was a staging area right over the hill of the Battle of the Bulge for the Northern Shoulder. Hitler had been massing men and tanks and artillery for the Ardennes offensive that was going to take place about 10 days later. And the Rangers didn't know that at the time, and neither did the American High Command. And Hill 400 was this very, very high hill that could see into that assembly area potentially. And the Germans wanted it back at all costs. The other part of the hill that was important was it was good for artillery observation. And basically, when the Germans controlled that hill, they were picking off anything that was coming within 5 miles of the hill. So it was making everything very, very costly. The Rangers were basically the last reserve force. Bergstein was barely taken by almost a regiment of Americans. It's mostly a tank group that assaulted the town, and they were holding on by their fingernails. One account said that if daylight didn't come, 30 minutes, within a half an hour, they would have lost the town because the Germans were overrunning it. They were throwing men in there left and right, and it was like a miniature Stalingrad. And these guys were exhausted. And the only way to keep Bergstein and then to take this hill was to send in the last reserve, the Allied reserve that they had in the Hurtgen Forest, which was the 2nd Ranger Battalion. That's what the command did. They sent them in, and they basically, the first part of the operation was to sweep through and take the rest of Bergstein from the Germans, and then they crept up to this kind of sunken road, which is similar to the sunken roads if you picture them in Civil War history. They creep up to the sunken road, and there's a little bit of a stone kind of fence on top of it. And as they get up to the road, the sunken road, they overlook this large field, and the men have to make a frontal assault across the field. And on the other side of the field there are a lot of Germans with MG-42s, and they're waiting. And making matters worse, the American artillery is coming in to to basically prep the battlefield and destroy German machine gun nests that are the Rangers have to encounter. And on the other side is German artillery that's falling in Bergstein, and it's creeping closer to the Rangers behind this sunken road. And both the artillery barrages are creeping closer and closer to the Rangers, and they know that if they don't go within a few seconds, the two barrages will meet and they'll be annihilated. And then what's incredible about the story is one of the officers orders a man out to scout out this open field, which is about as stupid as it gets, because everybody knows that he's going to die. You can't just stand up and scout something out. And everybody in the group tells the man, don't follow the order. And it just gets, several of the men say, F you, don't follow that order. And then somebody else yells, it's a direct order, go. And the man goes. He follows his orders, and he's shot through the stomach. And what happens is this triggers the charge. And these men launch this bayonet charge. They actually go about 20 seconds before they're supposed to go, which saves all of their lives as they charge across the field, because they avoid the barrages that are going to be coming down. It also opens up a window where the German machine gunners are sort of caught unaware as they charge across the field, and they basically descend on these MG-42 machine gun positions right in front of the base of the hill. And they kill most of the Germans, and those that they don't kill basically run up the hill for their lives as they storm the hill and then seize it within an hour. And then, but the real battle begins shortly after that, where the Germans then counterattack the hill multiple times.
It makes for intense reading. At that point in the book, I just kept going. And when I got to the point where you unmask the big surprise, where they see the German buildup, the information is passed on, and you've got your little asterisk there that says that the information was passed on and not acted on. That was such a surprise that really I just had to sit there and think about that for a minute, because it was really something. And the whole book is such an education that I'm going to have to read it again at some point, because it's like, yeah, these guys are fantastic. They did the Pointe Du Hoc thing, and oh, by the way, they did all this other stuff too, and it's all the other stuff that lends testimony to their greatness in a way that I think it's long overdue, and I'm really glad you did this.
Thank you. And I would also note that one of the great Ranger veterans in this book, Tom Ruggiero, before Len Lamel died, they tried to obtain the Presidential Unit Citation for the unit for Hill 400, and they deserve it. And Tom is now actively pursuing that to obtain the Presidential Unit Citation, which the Rangers really deserve for taking Hill 400. It's an incredible act, and it needs. Hopefully, this book maybe will give that another look.
Well, with that in mind, I'm curious to know, just because you brought up the subject, when petitions like that are made, how seriously do officials, elected officials, bureaucrats, how seriously do they take the historical record?
They look at all the documents, and it's a hard process. I can say that it's been done in the past. A unit that I know quite well, it's an independent parachute battalion, the 551st. They were nominated for the Presidential Unit Citation back during the war, and for a variety of reasons, it was never awarded. It took them several years. It took a book or two. It took a lot of pushing by veterans and elected officials to finally get the record straightened out, and the men were given the Presidential Unit Citation, rightfully so. And I think the case is even stronger, though, for Hill 400, because it was truly an epic battle, and one against all odds. They could have changed the course of the war.
After what I have just recently read, I don't dispute that at all. So now, as we're coming up to the end of the program, I'd like to turn to a couple of more esoteric questions here. What was beyond the obvious, the putting together of the histories, the going around, the interviewing of the people? When you are by yourself and it's just you and the computer, what was the hardest part of putting this thing together?
The hardest part of putting this together. Sometimes it's just getting started. That's always sometimes the first step in a journey, a long journey, is always sometimes the hardest, and just just getting moving. That was challenging. A little bit of writer's block, and I pulled something out of the hat that I had done in the past with Give Me Tomorrow. I went on a long train trip, and that's how I got going with Dog Company. I got a rail pass on Amtrak, and I just toured the country, and I read through the records, and I started to write Dog Company there, and that helped.
Okay, now in the past you have told me that either you've said that sometimes your books, the next story just finds you. So this is normally the part in the show where I ask the writer, what's next? So I'm curious to know, has your next story found you yet, or are you still looking?
Yes, they have.
I was foolish to ask, wasn't I?
And I'll reveal them offline to you.
I am a soldier and I'm marching on. I am a warrior and this is my song. My eyes are steeled and my gaze is bone. I am a warrior and this is my song.
Dog Company is a good read, to be sure, and I think it'll stand the test of time as a piece of military history. But there is one more thing that I'd like you all to consider before we bring this program to a close today. The military profession will most certainly regard this book as a monument to the men of D Company. As noble as that is, I'd like to point out that without the efforts of this author, many of the people named in this manuscript would have no proof of their existence left behind to future generations at all. Military history is cool because it's got sex and violence and political intrigue, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. History is a gift that we give to future generations, and we can pass it along to them on papyrus or paper or on CD-ROM or on some other future form of electronic format that nobody's dreamed of yet. We can say what we did right and we can say what we did wrong using both pictures and words. The hardest part for all historians, regardless of their field of study, will always be the communication of those values which they hold most near and dear. You know, if you stop and think about it for a moment, me and my fellow show contributors are adding to the historical record each time we upload one of these programs to the internet. So, if you like what you've heard here today, please feel free to find us online at www.politicsandpatriotism.com. And if you're of a more mobile persuasion, you can go to Stitcher.com, and thanks to the nice people over at Stitcher Smart Radio Network, you can download the free app, which will allow us to fit snugly into your iPhone or your Android device so that we can be with you wherever you are. So on behalf of everyone here at the show, thank you for your time and have a good day.